In 2019, my organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, was organised or hosted a Media Freedom Summit, and we wanted to look at the impact of national security legislation on Australian journalism. And the opening keynote speaker was the eminent Australian jurist and lawyer Brett Walker SC. In his remarks, Walker described what he believed to be the preeminent issue facing the news industry today, and he called it the Assange problem, and by that he meant the problem of legally defining who is a journalist. Now, he argued that we can't even begin to talk about protecting media freedom if we can't agree on who deserves protection. And in tying it back to Australia's most famous digital disruptor, Walker was really articulating the way that people tend to approach the problem by describing the term journalist in a way that either includes or excludes Julian Assange, depending on whether they believe he is or is not a journalist. Now, for Walker and so many others, Assange sits squarely in the middle of the infuriatingly wide grey zone that exists around the edges of the industry. We can all point to those who would uncontroversially be described as journalists, the leading award-winning voices on the BBC like Jeremy Bowen or Lindsay Hilson on Channel 4 News, or the big names in print journalism like Anthony Lloyd. But why? Outside of their employment status or the business cards they carry, what sets them apart from other talented writers and bloggers? Those people who toil in their own digital niches to produce work that might look like journalism, but simply doesn't make the grade. Now, it might help to think on the other end, those who should be denied the right to use that term, and therefore any privileges that go with it. How do the police meaningfully distinguish between a professional reporter from a mainstream news organisation with years of experience, quite possibly with a degree or two in journalism and politics, and a random member of the public, both live tweeting from the same anti-vax rally? And how do we thread the needle in a way that protects legitimate journalism without undermining anyone's freedom of speech? Well, the UN Human Rights Committee defines journalism as functions shared by a wide variety of actors, including professional full-time reporters and analysts, as well as bloggers and others who engage in self-publication in print, on the internet, or elsewhere. That is, I would argue, a spectacularly unhelpful definition that embraces pretty much anyone. Now, the point is that if we define journalists so widely that we protect everyone who publishes online or is involved in anything that looks like reporting, we wind up including anyone with a smartphone and a social media account. But in that world, the term becomes so utterly meaningless that it makes no sense to define it at all. Media freedom thus becomes another way of saying simply freedom of speech, rendering the whole idea redundant. Now, I appreciate this is not a new debate. As far back as 1999, when the digital revolution was just beginning to unfold, the American academic Clay Calvert concluded that finding a precise and appropriate definition of news and journalism is a nearly impossible task. We've seen a proliferation of papers all tackling the subject, none in a way that I find satisfying. The American academic Sonia West has argued that the US Constitution specifically mentions freedom of the press because it plays a particular democratic role that goes above and beyond the much broader but no less important right to freedom of speech. There exist certain speakers who fulfill unique roles in our democracy, she said. These press speakers devote time, resources, and expertise to the vital constitutional tasks of informing the public on newsworthy matters and providing a check on the government and the powerful. We must recognise those speakers in order to consider and potentially protect their specific needs. In other words, if we accept there is a particular democratic need for legitimate public interest reporting that holds our governments to account, we have to find a way that meaningfully defines and thus protects it. Now, in breaking down the definitions, it became clear that there are four broad approaches to the question, and they can be loosely described as the 4 Ps. Each is a valid way of thinking about the problem, and a good definition can and probably should draw on some elements of all, but only one approach comes closest to tackling the problem we're trying to solve. The traditional legal approach focuses on the first P, the person, the who. It typically considers their professional affiliation or employment status. It's rooted in the idea that a journalist is someone who works in a newsroom. In 1992, here in Australia, we got the first statutory definition of journalist in Australian Commonwealth law. That was Section 2025 of the Commonwealth Broadcasting Services Act, and it said Journalist means a person engaged in the profession or practice of reporting, photographing, editing, recording, or making television or radio programs of a news, current affairs, information, or documentary character. Now, that definition is also very close to being redundant in a world where television and radio are being replaced by video and audio. The notion of professional practice is also problematic because it puts part-timers, academics, student journalists, community radio station volunteers, and a host of others in an uncomfortably grey area. Perhaps a better approach is to focus on the second P, the product, the content that journalists produce. Now, as we saw earlier, the Commonwealth Broadcast Services Act unhelpfully describes it as programs of a news, current affairs, information, or documentary character. That might have been clear enough back in 1992 when television news was what everyone watched at 6 p.m, but it now risks elevating all sorts of questionable YouTube or TikTok news channels to the status of journalism. We run into real problems around content designed to have the character of journalism, but that clearly is not. How do we draw the line between a TV report about a climate change produced by the BBC and posted to YouTube and something that looks very similar but comes from a group financed by the oil and gas industry? It's very difficult to make a meaningful distinction between what most of us would think of as genuine journalism and content that is journalism-like. The third P is the purpose, the reason we think that journalism should be protected in the first place. The democratic fourth estate role of the media is typically understood as public interest journalism. Now, if journalism has any value, surely it must be to serve the public interest in some way that rises above the content that pours out of our devices. The Australian government clearly believes it is worth protecting. Out of growing concern for the direction of news, a Senate Select Committee was convened in 2017 on the future of public interest journalism. That focus on public interest often creeps into discussions around the value of journalism, though the concept remains conflicted and notoriously difficult to pin down. What exactly does it mean when it comes to journalism? How are we supposed to decide if a journalist writes something that is not in the public interest? And if a journalist works for the Times, does that mean everything they write is in the public interest by definition? What if we could find a way of avoiding it altogether? Well, to me, for something that to serve the public interest, it must be qualitatively different from other content. It has to meet the classic journalistic standards of accuracy, fairness, balance, and so on, so that consumers of that content can have a level of confidence they wouldn't have when they're opening a website hawking natural cancer remedies. Crucially, that seems to be where the Senate's Public Interest Journalism Committee finally settled. In its report, the committee said, the evidence received by the committee overwhelmingly noted that even if there is no unanimously accepted single definition of the public interest journalism, there are certain behaviours, institutions and principles that have been commonly cited when discussing its role and importance in healthy democracies. Inadvertently, the committee, I think, seems to have stumbled on what is the solution to the problem. What if we stop worrying about the person, the product, or the purpose altogether, and instead pay attention to the behaviours, institutions, and principles that lie behind them all? What if we focus on the final P, the process of journalism? Back in 2019, Australian police raided journalists from 2 news organisations on consecutive days looking for evidence of the sources to stories that relied on leaked classified documents. Now, the raids triggered media outrage, but the then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, retorted that journalists could not place themselves above the law. They could not think of themselves as self-appointed elite, publishing things that nobody else could. I agree. But as Sonia West argued, the whole point of press freedom is not to protect a special group of individuals, it's to protect their democratic role. And this is key. Press freedom is a subset of freedom of speech. We single it out precisely because we recognise it has that particular function that deserves protection beyond what we more widely understand as speech. We accept the need for a group of people who reliably and professionally collect and report accurate, credible, authoritative information and who can perform that classic fourth estate role. So if we set aside the job title for a moment, under the hood we find that journalism, regardless of who produces it, depends on the way that information is gathered, organised and presented. It's the stuff that journalism academics routinely teach students. Underpinning the whole journalistic enterprise is not an employment contract or a business card, but a set of professional concepts, practices, standards, obligations and ethics. That is where we should turn to for a legal definition. Now, this idea isn't radically new. It already exists in Australia's statutes. Section 126K of the Victorian Evidence Act is the shield law for journalists. In setting out its definition, the Act starts the traditional way. It says that journalist means a person engaged in the profession or occupation of journalism. Now, as we've seen, that idea unhelpfully shuts out part-timers, students, volunteers, and so on, who may not be sufficiently engaged in the profession to count in the eyes of the law, even if they are producing content that is every bit as good as any full-time reporter. But the Act then goes on to say, the person or the publisher of the information, comment, opinion, or analysis is accountable to comply through a complaints process with recognised journalistic or media professional standards or codes of practice. There lies that bit of legal genius. I think it's reasonable to assume that if someone declares a commitment to a set of standards and ethics and then gives the public a way of holding them to account for deviations, then they're working to a much higher standard than your average social media punter or YouTube bloviator. It's hard to see satirists or bloggers making themselves accountable to the NUJ's code of practice. And if they do, well, then they're probably practicing journalism. My organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, has been thinking about this for some time, and we've developed a working definition. Journalism means A, the practice of investigating, collecting, verifying and or preparing editing for dissemination of information, commentary, opinion or analysis, including but not limited to news and current affairs. B, for the purpose of making that information available to the public or a section of the public. And C, in respect of which a relevant person or persons abides by a journalist code of practice or the organisation for which they work is governed by or submits to a journalist code of practice. Now notice that we avoid using the word journalist, dodging the problem that the Prime Minister Scott Morrison pointed to. We're not arguing for protecting a group of people that are broadly despised or at least mistrusted. Instead, by looking at the process of journalism, we're drawing attention to the mechanisms that lie behind reliable, trustworthy and accurate reporting. Nobody gets special treatment, so anyone who is working to that standard, regardless of job title, background or employer, deserves to have their work protected. We protect the role they play by defining the process they use. It takes us back to the reason we elevate press freedom in the first place. Crucially, that approach has no impact on anyone else. It doesn't affect freedom of speech. It doesn't stop the satirists, the bloggers, or the random opinionators from saying whatever they want within the limits of hate speech and defamation. They just can't claim journalistic privileges if they're not applying journalistic processes. And also notice that our definition doesn't set out what those ethics and standards should be. No government should be allowed to say what is and what is not journalism. That would simply offer a tool for censorship. Instead, we leave that to the industry to answer the question. By establishing a process of journalism in law, but leaving it to recognise journalistic or media professional standards or codes of practice, would give the industry the agency, indeed the imperative, to debate and decide what that looks like in practice. That shouldn't be particularly controversial. There will always be arguments around the edges of journalism, but newsroom codes of practice and producer guidelines tend to contain the same core elements. They're the same ones you teach your students. This isn't the only solution to the crisis facing journalism, of course, but we need to have some serious conversations about what journalism really means and to find a way to hold practitioners to that standard. I think our legal definition achieves that. It gives us a meaningful way of ring-fencing work that plays its democratic role without limiting anyone else's rights. It also sets up a system that provides upward pressure on journalism. If you know that your work has to make a certain grade to enjoy legal top cover, you're far more likely to go that extra step to make sure it is sound. In a world where fake is often put next to news, that must surely be a good thing. Thanks very much.